The unseen cry. Pastor Michael Thompson had always believed in the quiet rhythms of life in Fairfield. The small town, nestled among rolling hills, had a way of settling into peaceful routines. Church bells rang every Sunday morning. Children ran down the streets with the sound of their laughter filling the air. And the old oak trees in the town square seemed to whisper stories of generations past. But this particular day felt different. There was an odd sense of stillness that hung in the air, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Pastor Thompson, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and kind, worn eyes, had grown accustomed to the quiet days. He had dedicated the last 2 decades of his life to the small community, providing spiritual guidance, leading prayer sessions, and offering a comforting presence in times of grief. The church, with its white steeple reaching toward the sky, had been a constant in his life, a place of solace and hope. That afternoon, as the sun blazed high in the cloudless sky, the peaceful stillness of the town was broken by a faint sound. It was a soft cry, the kind that might be easily mistaken for the distant mew of a cat, or the wind rustling through the trees. But as Pastor Thompson's boots crunched against the gravel pathway leading up to the church, his senses heightened. Something about the sound didn't sit right with him. It felt urgent, desperate. He paused for a moment, his brow furrowing in confusion. His mind quickly tried to process what he was hearing. He scanned the area around the church, his eyes moving from the perfectly manicured hedges to the street beyond. There was no one in sight. The town was typically deserted in the afternoon, as most of the townsfolk were busy with their daily routines. But the cry persisted, louder now, unmistakably human, and filled with a sense of helplessness. Pastor Thompson's heart began to race. His footsteps quickened as he moved toward the church steps, the sound of the baby's cries growing more distinct with every step. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was something in his gut telling him that something was terribly wrong. He pushed open the wrought iron gates that led to the church courtyard and turned the corner toward the entrance. And then he saw it. By the base of the church's grand marble steps, a metal trash can stood slightly askew. It wasn't unusual for the wind to blow things around in the town, but today the scene felt out of place. The lid was partially lifted, and the cries, now clearer and more urgent, were emanating from within. Pastor Thompson's breath caught in his chest. His legs moved before his mind could process the full gravity of the situation. He crossed the few steps that led to the trash can, and hesitated only for a second before he gently lifted the lid, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw inside left him breathless. A tiny baby, no more than a few days old, was wrapped in a thin, ragged blanket. The child's face was flushed, tears streaking down the soft skin. His tiny fists were balled up, his mouth wide in a cry that broke Pastor Thompson's heart. The baby's body was so small, so fragile, and it was clear that this innocent life had been discarded with little care. The pastor's hands trembled as he carefully lifted the child from the trash can, cradling him in his arms. His mind raced, emotions surging within him. How could this happen? How could someone, anyone, do this to an innocent child? "Sweet child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. His heart ached as he held the baby close, rocking him gently in his arms. The baby's cries softened, as if sensing the safety of Pastor Thompson's embrace. Without thinking, the pastor turned and hurried into the church. He didn't know what he would do, but the only thing he could think of was to get the child inside, away from the elements, and keep him safe. The door creaked open as he stepped across the threshold, carrying the fragile infant in his arms. The dim light inside the church was a contrast to the bright, harsh sunlight outside, and for a moment, Pastor Thompson felt a wave of calm. He moved quickly through the quiet sanctuary, his footsteps echoing off the old wooden pews and stained glass windows. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, none of them coherent. He placed the child gently in one of the church's small cribs, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might be of use. The child needed warmth, nourishment, and care. He quickly set to work, rummaging through the church's small supply of baby items that had been donated over the years. As he gathered what he needed, a thought pierced his mind. How had this child ended up here? It didn't make sense. The pastor had lived in Fairfield for so long, and he had never heard of anything like this happening. The town was known for its strong sense of community, where neighbors watched out for one another, and the church had always been a place of comfort for those in need. The more Pastor Thompson thought about it, the more questions arose. Who had left the child in the trash can? And why? Was there something the baby's parents were running from? Or had the child been abandoned out of pure neglect? As he gently wrapped the baby in a clean blanket, the questions seemed to swirl around him like an unrelenting storm. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't let this child slip through the cracks. He would care for him as his own, no matter the cost. For the next few hours, Pastor Thompson remained at the church, caring for Elijah. The baby's cries had long since stopped, and now the child slept soundly in the crib, swaddled in warmth and comfort. The pastor sat nearby, watching over him, trying to come to terms with the enormity of the situation. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary circumstance, that this child was destined for something greater. Later that afternoon, Pastor Thompson made a call to the local authorities, explaining the situation and notifying them of the discovery. He knew that protocol dictated that the child be taken to the authorities, but part of him couldn't bear the thought of letting go. There was a bond, however small, that had formed in those brief moments of holding the baby. He knew that he had to protect this child, no matter what. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the churchyard, Pastor Thompson stood alone in the sanctuary, gazing down at Elijah. His heart swelled with a mixture of emotions: fear, hope, love, and uncertainty. What was the future for this child? What had brought him to this moment, abandoned and alone? And what would the next chapter of his life look like? Pastor Thompson didn't have the answers, but in that moment, he made a promise to himself and to the child sleeping peacefully in the crib. He would protect him, care for him, and love him as if he were his own. Whatever the boy's past had been, Pastor Thompson was determined to be part of his future. And little did the pastor know, the discovery of Elijah would lead him down a path that would change everything he thought he knew about life, love, and destiny. A growing bond. The weeks that followed Elijah's discovery were a whirlwind of activity, both for Pastor Michael Thompson and the town of Fairfield. Word quickly spread throughout the small community about the baby found abandoned at the church steps, and soon people arrived at the church with gifts, supplies, and offers of help. The town, which had always been tight-knit and supportive, rallied around the baby boy. Their collective generosity felt like a balm for the deep wound of the boy's abandonment. Pastor Thompson, who had always been a solitary figure in many respects, now found himself surrounded by well-wishers and helpers. But in all the bustle, he never let go of his personal commitment to care for Elijah as his own son. His life, which had been dedicated to ministry and service, had suddenly taken on an entirely new dimension. Elijah, despite his rough beginning, began to thrive in the warm, caring environment that the pastor had created for him. Pastor Thompson had learned to balance the responsibilities of running the church, organizing services, and caring for the baby, though the latter was a full-time job in itself. Late nights became routine as he fed Elijah, rocked him to sleep, and whispered comforting words to the boy. Slowly, the weeks turned into months, and Elijah grew into a healthy, strong infant with wide, inquisitive eyes. He was a curious child, always reaching for new things and exploring his surroundings with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. At first, Pastor Thompson had hesitated when it came to sharing Elijah's story with others. He felt protective of the child, unsure of how the town would react to the unknown circumstances surrounding Elijah's arrival. But as time passed and Elijah became more of a fixture in the community, Pastor Thompson saw the incredible bond that had already formed between the child and the people of Fairfield. The congregation embraced Elijah with open arms. Some people would visit regularly, bringing homemade meals, offering prayers, or just sitting quietly with the boy, sharing stories and laughter. Even the children in the church had begun to take an interest in Elijah. They treated him as a little brother, gathering around him during services, asking to hold him or play with him after church. And Elijah, sweet, innocent Elijah, seemed to draw something out of them. A tenderness, a protectiveness. The boy's arrival seemed to awaken something deeper within the congregation, a renewed sense of community and family. But despite all the love surrounding him, Pastor Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story yet to be told, a story that had yet to unfold, one that lay hidden in the shadows of Elijah's past. Every time Elijah looked up at him with those innocent eyes, the question lingered at the back of Pastor Thompson's mind. Who was this child, really? There was a part of the pastor that wanted to shield Elijah from the harsh truths of the world, to protect him from the painful reality of how he had come into the world. But there was another part of him, a part driven by faith and a deep-rooted sense of responsibility, that knew that Elijah's story was important, not just for Elijah, but for the community, for the world. The pastor knew that one day Elijah would need to understand his past, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Pastor Thompson felt that it was his duty to uncover that past. As Elijah's first birthday approached, Pastor Thompson began to look into the origins of the boy's story. There had been no information about Elijah's birth or his parents. The authorities had conducted their own investigation when the boy had been found, but their efforts had been fruitless. There were no birth records, no hospital documentation, and no indication of who the child's biological parents were. The only thing that the pastor knew for certain was that someone who had made a choice to abandon a child, had left Elijah in the most unimaginable of circumstances. Pastor Thompson had tried to move past the unanswered questions, focusing instead on the joy of raising Elijah. But deep inside, there was a nagging feeling that he couldn't ignore. He had been entrusted with this child's life, and he couldn't, in good conscience, leave the questions surrounding Elijah's origins unanswered. It was the middle of autumn when Pastor Thompson decided to take action. The crisp air smelled the fallen leaves, and the town was busy preparing for the upcoming harvest festival. He made up his mind to visit the local orphanage, thinking that perhaps the staff there might have some information about Elijah or his family. It was a long shot, but he knew he had to try. The orphanage was a large red brick building on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind a line of maple trees. The building had been there for as long as anyone could remember, serving as a place of refuge for abandoned or orphaned children. Pastor Thompson had visited the orphanage many times over the years, leading prayer services and offering support to the children. But today, he was there for a different reason. He rang the bell at the front gate, and soon, a kind-faced woman with silver hair answered the door. Her name was Mrs. Jenkins, and she had worked at the orphanage for decades. She was a gentle soul who had dedicated her life to the children in her care, and Pastor Thompson trusted her. "Pastor Thompson, it's good to see you," Mrs. Jenkins said warmly as she invited him inside. "What brings you here today?" "I'm here about Elijah," Pastor Thompson began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I need to know more about him, about where he came from, about who his parents are." Mrs. Jenkins' expression softened as she listened to the pastor's request. She led him to a small, quiet room in the back of the orphanage where they could talk without interruption. "Pastor, I wish I could give you the answers you seek," Mrs. Jenkins said. "But the truth is, we don't know much about Elijah's past. When he was brought in, there were no papers, no birth certificate. It was as if he appeared out of nowhere." The pastor's heart sank, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. There must be something, some record, something that could shed light on who he is. Mrs. Jenkins sat down across from him, her face a picture of concern. "I'm afraid not. We have a small file on him, but it's only the basics. He was left at the church steps, with nothing more than the blanket he was wrapped in. We couldn't even find out where he came from, let alone who left him there. It's as if someone wanted to erase all traces of his past." Pastor Thompson was silent for a moment, processing the information. He had hoped for a breakthrough, but the truth seemed as elusive as ever. There had to be something he could do. As he left the orphanage, he felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. The answers were slipping further away, but he couldn't stop. Elijah deserved to know the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. Pastor Thompson made a silent vow to the child in his care that he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the mystery of his origins. Back at the church, the day continued as usual, with Elijah's laughter ringing through the halls. And for the pastor, the questions would keep coming. But for now, all he could do was love this child as his own, knowing that, no matter what the truth was, Elijah had already found a home in his heart, and that, Pastor Thompson knew, was enough for the moment. Secrets unfold. The months that followed Pastor Michael Thompson's visit to the orphanage felt like an emotional roller coaster. He had made a quiet, personal commitment to uncover Elijah's past, but the more he tried to dig, the more elusive the answers became. The town of Fairfield, with its small-town charm, was kind and welcoming, yet when it came to uncovering the history of an abandoned child, its secrets remained stubbornly locked away. In the church, Pastor Thompson continued his work, dedicating his time to both the spiritual needs of his congregation and the physical and emotional needs of Elijah. As the boy grew, his bond with the pastor deepened. Elijah's wide, curious eyes seemed to absorb everything around him, and Pastor Thompson often marveled at how quickly the child was learning. His first words came just a few months ago, and now at nearly 2 years old, Elijah was beginning to walk, and his laughter could often be heard echoing through the church halls. The church had become more than just a sanctuary for the people of Fairfield. It was a home for Elijah. His laughter brought light to the church's old stone walls, and his small hands would often play with the worn wooden pews during services. The congregation had embraced the child as their own, helping to raise him in their own way. Yet, despite all of the love and warmth that surrounded Elijah, Pastor Thompson couldn't escape the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. The past continued to haunt him, the past of a child he loved, but knew so little about. In the evenings, after the last of the churchgoers had left, and the sun dipped below the horizon, Pastor Thompson would sit alone in his study, surrounded by papers, trying to piece together the mystery of Elijah's origins. There were no clues in the records at the local orphanage. The authorities had come up with nothing. Even the church's records offered no insights. Elijah's birth certificate was a ghost, as if his very existence had been erased from the world. One rainy evening, as Pastor Thompson pored over a pile of old records, he received a phone call. It was an unfamiliar number, but something inside him told him to answer it. "Pastor Thompson, is this Michael Thompson?" A woman's voice asked, a tremor of urgency in her tone. "Yes, this is he," the pastor replied, his heart quickening. "How can I help you?" "My name is Rachel Lewis," the woman said, her voice shaky but determined. "I believe I know something about the boy you've been caring for." "Elijah." The pastor sat up straight in his chair, his pulse racing. "Elijah? How do you know about him?" Rachel paused before speaking again. "I've been following the news about him. You see, I'm the one who left him there." The words hit Pastor Thompson like a cold wave. His breath caught in his chest, and for a moment, he was paralyzed by the realization that the person on the other end of the phone was someone who had been part of Elijah's heartbreaking past. The question that had haunted him for so long was finally being answered, but not in the way he had expected. "Rachel," Pastor Thompson said slowly, trying to steady his voice, "you left him at the church steps." "Yes," Rachel replied, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what else to do. I never wanted to leave him like that, but I had no choice. I was desperate." The pastor's mind raced with 1,000 questions. What happened? Why did you leave him? Who are you? Where is Elijah's father? Rachel was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was full of pain. "I'm not his mother, at least not in the way you think. I raised him for the first year of his life, but I'm not his biological mother." Pastor Thompson felt the air around him grow thick with tension. Every word Rachel spoke seemed to add layers of complexity to Elijah's already mysterious history. You raised him, but you left him on the steps of the church. Why? I couldn't keep him, Rachel sobbed. I had to give him up. He wasn't safe with me. Her voice trembled with guilt. His real mother, she was involved with dangerous people I couldn't escape from. I thought I was protecting Elijah by taking him away, but I was wrong. I should have found a way to keep him. The pastor could barely comprehend what he was hearing. The child he had come to love as his own was somehow tangled up in a dark and dangerous web. Elijah's birth mother, whoever she was, had been involved with people who had put the child's life at risk. And Rachel, who had raised him for the first year, had made the gut-wrenching decision to separate from him in an effort to protect him. What do you mean by dangerous people? Pastor Thompson asked, his voice low but steady. Rachel took a deep breath before speaking. Elijah's birth mother wasn't just anyone. She had connections to people who were part of something much bigger, something illegal. I didn't know all the details, but I knew they were dangerous. I knew I couldn't keep Elijah in that environment. I thought I could protect him by leaving him at the church. I thought it would be the safest place for him. Pastor Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. The implications of what Rachel was saying were enormous. Elijah, this sweet, innocent child, was tied to a world of shadows and danger that had been hidden from the town of Fairfield. He realized then that Elijah was more than just a child abandoned at a doorstep. His existence was tied to forces far beyond what Pastor Thompson could have ever imagined. Rachel, where is Elijah's biological mother now? Pastor Thompson asked, his voice full of concern. Rachel's silence was deafening. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. She's gone, Pastor. She's been gone for a long time. She disappeared without a trace, and I haven't heard from her in years. The pastor's mind raced. He was faced with a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, disbelief, and above all, a profound sadness. The woman who had given birth to Elijah was gone, and the man who had raised him, at least for the first year, was left in a dangerous world of secrets. Pastor Thompson knew he had to protect Elijah at all costs. But he also knew that the answers he had been searching for were now more complicated than ever. The past, with all its shadows, had come rushing back, and it seemed as if Elijah's history was far more tangled and dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. Rachel continued, her voice now filled with regret. I never wanted this life for Elijah. I wanted him to have a chance, a real chance at happiness. That's why I brought him to the church. I thought you could give him that. I thought you could be the father he needed. The pastor's heart swelled with a mixture of love and sorrow. You did the right thing by bringing him here. He's safe here, Rachel. But I need to know more. I need to know how to protect him. These people you're talking about, are they still looking for him? Rachel's voice broke. I don't know, but I think they are. I think they've been watching him. And now that you've found him, I'm afraid they might come for him. The pastor felt a deep sense of responsibility wash over him. This was no longer just a story of an abandoned child. It was a story of survival, of escape, and of a dangerous past that was now encroaching upon the peaceful life Elijah had begun to build in Fairfield. He turned his gaze toward the small room where Elijah slept, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him. Pastor Thompson promised, in that moment, that he would protect this child, no matter the cost. Elijah's past might have been shrouded in mystery, but one thing was certain. His future would be shaped by love, by protection, and by the unwavering commitment of those who cared for him. Pastor Thompson hung up the phone with Rachel, his mind spinning. The weight of what he had learned was immense, but he knew that, the shadow of the past. The following weeks in Fairfield seemed to pass in a blur. Pastor Michael Thompson felt the weight of his new responsibility pressing on him more heavily with each passing day. Elijah, the sweet and innocent child who had brought so much joy into the pastor's life, was now entangled in a story far darker than anyone in the town could have imagined. The revelation from Rachel, the woman who had cared for Elijah in his early years, had uncovered layers of danger that lurked just beneath the surface of the quiet, peaceful town. Though Pastor Thompson continued to care for Elijah with the same love and devotion he always had, his thoughts were never far from the conversation he'd had with Rachel. She had told him the truth about Elijah's origins, a past filled with shadowy figures and dangerous people that had made her take the painful decision to leave the boy at the church in hopes of saving him from a life of crime and danger. Rachel's confession had haunted him. If what she said was true, then Elijah wasn't just an abandoned child. He was a child who had been marked by a dark past, a past that, according to Rachel, was now looking for him. Days after their phone conversation, Pastor Thompson had spent sleepless nights pacing the church, praying for guidance. He had no idea who these dangerous people were or how they might come after Elijah, but one thing was clear: Elijah wasn't safe, and he needed to be protected. The love he had for the boy was immense, and the thought of anyone coming to harm him made Pastor Thompson's blood run cold. As the days passed, the pastor found himself grappling with more questions than answers. Who were these people? What were they involved in? And how far would they go to find Elijah? The more he thought about it, the more desperate he became to shield the boy from whatever forces might come their way. He knew he couldn't face this battle alone. And so, after much contemplation, Pastor Thompson reached out to an old friend, someone who had experience in situations much darker than the pastor had ever encountered. Detective Sarah Matthews, a no-nonsense investigator with the local police force, had been a close friend of his for many years. They had worked together on several community projects, and Pastor Thompson trusted her implicitly. Sarah had always been a straightforward, pragmatic person. She was known for her sharp mind and her dedication to solving cases, no matter how difficult they seemed. When Pastor Thompson explained the situation, her demeanor shifted from curiosity to concern. She agreed to meet him the next day at the church to discuss what they could do to protect Elijah. The following morning, Sarah arrived at the church, her usual calm and collected presence reassuring to Pastor Thompson. As they sat down in the pastor's small office, he could see the concern in her eyes. "I've known you a long time, Mike," Sarah began, "and I can tell something's weighing heavily on you." "What's going on?" Pastor Thompson took a deep breath. "It's Elijah. I've learned some things about his past, things that are troubling." He told Sarah everything Rachel had confessed to him: the child's abandonment, the dangerous people connected to his biological mother, and the fear that they might still be looking for him. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowed as she processed the information. When he finished, she nodded slowly, her gaze focused on the desk in front of her. "Mike, this is serious," Sarah said, her voice low. "You're right to be worried. If these people are involved in anything criminal, they won't stop until they get what they want. I don't know what they're after, but if they've been watching Elijah, we have to assume they'll come for him." Pastor Thompson felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had known deep down that there was more to Elijah's past than he had been able to uncover, but hearing Sarah's confirmation of his fears made everything feel more real. Elijah's safety was no longer just a matter of keeping him away from the physical dangers of the world. It was a matter of keeping him hidden from people who would stop at nothing to find him. "I've been thinking about this a lot," Pastor Thompson continued. "I don't know who they are or what they want, but I do know that Elijah deserves a chance at a normal life. He deserves to be safe, but I can't do this alone. I need help." Sarah stood up and began to pace around the small room. "We can start by trying to track down more information. You said Rachel mentioned Elijah's biological mother was involved with dangerous people. Maybe we can dig into that. See if we can find any records or leads, and we'll need to keep Elijah hidden, at least for now. We can't take any chances." Pastor Thompson nodded. "I can do that. I'll keep Elijah here, and I'll do everything in my power to protect him. But I'm afraid of what might happen if we don't act quickly." Sarah's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure Elijah is safe." Over the next several days, Sarah worked tirelessly to dig into the mystery surrounding Elijah's past. She began by tracing any connections to Rachel and Elijah's biological mother, and the deeper she dug, the more disturbing the details became. Sarah had already known that Fairfield wasn't immune to crime, but the network she was uncovering was far more intricate than she had imagined. She was dealing with a group of criminals who operated on a scale far larger than local thugs or petty thieves. This was a syndicate, one with reach and resources, and if they had any interest in Elijah, it meant they were connected to something much more dangerous. Meanwhile, Pastor Thompson did everything he could to protect Elijah. He kept him close, taking extra precautions to ensure no one outside the town knew the child's location. The once vibrant church that had been filled with laughter and life now felt quieter, more solemn, as the weight of the danger hanging over them grew heavier with each passing day. Pastor Thompson had never felt so conflicted. His heart ached with the desire to keep Elijah safe, to allow the child to grow up free from the fear and darkness that had been Rachel's reality. But at the same time, he knew that Elijah's past, who he really was, and what had happened before he was abandoned at the church, was something they couldn't ignore. The phone call from Rachel had been the first crack in the facade of Elijah's world, and now the cracks were widening. The more the pastor learned, the more he realized that Elijah's story was intertwined with something far more complex, far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As the days grew shorter and the town prepared for the holidays, Pastor Thompson found himself torn between two opposing forces. One side of him wanted to protect the child at all costs, to keep him sheltered in the safety of the church. But the other side, the side driven by his faith, knew that the truth had to come to light. Elijah's story was more than just his own. It was a story that needed to be told, no matter the consequences. With every new piece of information that Sarah uncovered, Pastor Thompson felt more resolute in his decision to keep Elijah close. He couldn't, in good conscience, send the boy away to some distant, unknown place. Elijah had already been through so much, and Pastor Thompson knew he was the boy's protector, no matter what came next. But the deeper they ventured into the unknown, the more the pastor began to realize that he was fighting against something far bigger than he had ever imagined. And soon, he would have to make decisions that would affect not just his life, but the future of the entire town. The unraveling web. The weeks that followed Sarah Matthews' initial investigation seemed to stretch on endlessly. Fairfield, with its quaint, picturesque streets and friendly community, had begun to feel like a veneer, a thin, fragile layer over a world of secrets and danger that had long been hidden beneath the surface. As the investigation into Elijah's past deepened, it became clear that the town was not just facing a mystery. It was staring into the abyss of a criminal empire, one that had its roots in a faraway world that none of them could have imagined. Pastor Thompson continued to devote his every waking moment to Elijah, but even as he sought refuge in the boy's innocent laughter and curious eyes, the dark cloud of the child's past loomed over him. The more they learned, the more urgent the need to protect Elijah became. Yet the deeper they ventured into the shadows, the more perilous it all seemed. Detective Sarah Matthews was relentless. She had dug through records, followed old leads, and even made a few discreet inquiries into criminal organizations that might have had ties to Fairfield. And just as the pastor had feared, the deeper Sarah dug, the more complicated and dangerous things became. Her investigation had revealed a startling connection between Elijah's biological mother, Rachel, and a group known only in whispered circles as the Syndicate. Though the details remain murky, it was clear that this group was involved in organized crime on an international scale. The Syndicate had been operating under the radar for years, involved in everything from money laundering to arms trafficking, and possibly even human smuggling. As Sarah shared the details of her findings with Pastor Thompson, the full weight of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. I've traced Rachel's movements back to a few years before she gave Elijah up for adoption," Sarah explained one cold evening. After spending hours poring over documents in her office, she was involved with several people from the syndicate, including a man named Vince Carrick. He's one of their key operatives, and from what I've found, Rachel's involvement with him was much deeper than we thought. Pastor Thompson frowned, his heart sinking. "Do you think they're still looking for Elijah?" Sarah nodded grimly. "I'm certain of it. If Rachel was part of this organization, and if they know she had a child, they'll want him back. The syndicate doesn't just let things go. If Elijah is the son of Rachel, and they want him for some reason, they won't stop until they find him. This isn't just about a child being abandoned. It's about a much larger game." The pastor stood, pacing the room as he absorbed the gravity of Sarah's words. Every inch of his being wanted to keep Elijah close, to shield him from the storm that was coming. But how long could they keep the boy hidden? How long could they live in fear of what might happen when the past came crashing back to the present? The town of Fairfield had always felt like a peaceful retreat, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. But now it felt as though that tranquility had been shattered, replaced by an undercurrent of fear. Elijah's presence, once a light in the darkness, now felt like a beacon that could attract those seeking to claim him for their own. That evening, after Sarah left, Pastor Thompson sat alone in his study, the weight of the world pressing down on him. Elijah was safe for now. He was happy, healthy, and blissfully unaware of the growing threats surrounding him. But Pastor Thompson knew that time was running out. They had to make a choice. They couldn't keep hiding forever, not when the syndicate was closing in on them. The decision was clear in his mind. Elijah needed to be taken far away from Fairfield, hidden somewhere the syndicate could never find him. But where could he go? Where would the boy be safe from the people who were hunting him? The pastor wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. Elijah's safety came above all else. The next morning, Pastor Thompson made a decision. He would speak to Sarah again. Together, they would come up with a plan to get Elijah out of town and into hiding, as far away from the syndicate's reach as possible. He couldn't risk waiting any longer. As the days went by, the sense of urgency continued to grow. Sarah and Pastor Thompson began to piece together a plan, though the uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on both of them. They would need to act quickly, and they would need to be strategic. Moving Elijah out of town without anyone noticing was a delicate operation. They couldn't risk anyone knowing about the boy's connection to the syndicate, or it could be jeopardizing not only his safety but their own lives as well. The pastor made the painful decision to stop all public church events for the time being. The church would become a place of refuge, one where only those who were absolutely necessary knew the truth of what was happening. Word began to spread quietly through the congregation, but only a handful of people were privy to the full details of Elijah's origins. The rest of the town, however, remained blissfully unaware of the dark undercurrents now running through the town. Days turned into weeks, and plans were slowly taking shape. They had to keep their movements secret. Any slip-up could expose them, and any misstep could cost Elijah his life. Then, one cold evening, as the town prepared for another quiet winter night, disaster struck. It started with a phone call, a call that Pastor Thompson had been dreading. The phone rang late, its shrill sound echoing through the empty church. With a hesitant hand, the pastor answered, his voice tight with anticipation. "Pastor Thompson," came the voice on the other end. It was a man's voice, deep and menacing. "I know who you are, and I know where you are. We need to talk." The pastor's stomach dropped. The syndicate had found them. It had only been a matter of time. "Who is this?" Pastor Thompson asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man on the other end chuckled darkly. "Does it matter? I know where Elijah is. I know who you've been hiding. And if you don't want him to end up just like his mother, dead and forgotten, you'll come to me." The line went dead, and Pastor Thompson's heart raced in his chest. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The syndicate had made contact. They knew about Elijah. And now, they were making their move. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. The plan to get Elijah out of town was now a race against time. The man's words echoed in his mind. If you don't want him to end up just like his mother. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Elijah's mother hadn't just disappeared, she had been silenced. The syndicate had dealt with her, and they would stop at nothing to get Elijah. The boy was no longer just a child who had been abandoned. He was a target, a key player in a larger game. Pastor Thompson knew that the time for hiding was over. The syndicate was coming for Elijah, and they weren't going to stop until they had him in their grasp. The only choice now was to confront the threat head-on and hope they could outsmart the people who were coming for them. That night, Pastor Thompson gathered Sarah, and together they made the final preparations for the most dangerous step of all. They would take Elijah and disappear, no longer just trying to keep him safe, but fighting to keep him alive. The syndicate's reach was long, but they were determined to fight back. The story was no longer just about an abandoned child. It had become a battle for survival, a race against a deadly force, and no matter what it took, Pastor Thompson was ready to face whatever came next to keep Elijah safe. The pastor looked at the small boy who had grown into his life, and with a deep, resolute breath, he whispered, "We'll protect you, Elijah. We won't let them take you." The final stand. The days of uncertainty had finally reached their breaking point. Pastor Michael Thompson, once a simple man of faith who had dedicated his life to helping others, now found himself thrust into a battle that was far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. He had spent years building his life around a quiet, peaceful community, guiding his flock with gentle hands and wise counsel. But now, as he looked at the small boy sleeping peacefully in his arms, the weight of responsibility had never felt heavier. The phone call from the syndicate had shattered any illusion of safety. It was no longer just a question of Elijah's past or his identity. It was a question of survival. The people who had come after Elijah, who had been hiding in the shadows all this time, had now made their move. And there was no going back. Pastor Thompson had made a decision, one that filled him with a sense of dread, but also a strange sense of resolve. He couldn't hide anymore. The clock was ticking, and every second they spent in Fairfield, every second Elijah was exposed, brought them one step closer to the danger that was closing in. It was time to leave, but leaving meant more than just packing up and disappearing. They had to outsmart the people who were hunting them, and they had to do it fast. Sarah Matthews had been with him every step of the way. The two of them had spent countless hours in secret meetings, planning every move with the precision of military strategists. The syndicate had far more resources and reach than either of them could imagine, but they had something else on their side, something more powerful than any criminal organization, the element of surprise. For days, they had prepared the final plan. Elijah's safety came first, and that meant no stone could be left unturned. Pastor Thompson and Sarah made sure to change the boy's appearance, clothes, hair, even the way he walked. Every detail mattered. Every potential surveillance camera was accounted for, every phone call carefully planned. Sarah had used her connections in law enforcement to ensure there were no eyes watching their every move, but they knew that wouldn't be enough. The syndicate was resourceful, and they would stop at nothing to find Elijah. They had to move quickly. Elijah's safety depended on it. That fateful night, after weeks of preparation, they made their move. The pastor's car was packed with essentials, clothes, a few sentimental items, and most importantly, Elijah's favorite toys. They couldn't take everything, but they had to make sure the boy had what he needed to feel comforted in the unfamiliar life they were about to start. Pastor Thompson took one last look at the church. It had been his home for so many years, a place of peace and refuge. Now, it felt like a reminder of everything they were leaving behind. He took a deep breath and whispered a prayer. "Lord, protect us. Protect Elijah. Please, guide us through the darkness." The car rolled quietly down the winding streets of Fairfield, and Pastor Thompson felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He knew the town had no idea what was happening, No idea how close they were to losing one of its own. But in his heart, he knew he was doing the right thing. He had no choice. There was no place for Elijah to be safe in the town anymore. No place where they wouldn't find him. Sarah had arranged for a safe house outside of the city, a place that had been untouched by the world for years. It was an isolated cabin, hidden in the dense woods, far away from any prying eyes. It was the perfect hiding spot. But even then, Pastor Thompson knew it was only temporary. The syndicate's reach was vast, and sooner or later, they would find them. The real challenge would be keeping Elijah safe long enough to break free from their grip. The drive was long and silent. Elijah slept in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket, unaware of the danger that still hung over them. Pastor Thompson could hardly bring himself to look at the boy, not because he didn't love him, but because of the overwhelming guilt and fear that threatened to consume him. He had brought Elijah into this life, a life where he had to run, to hide, to be afraid. But it was for the boy's survival, and Pastor Thompson would do anything to ensure Elijah had the chance to grow up in peace, away from the violence of his past. As the car rolled further away from the town, Sarah's words from the night before echoed in his mind. "They won't give up, Mike. You know that, right? The syndicate won't stop until they get what they want." Pastor Thompson nodded silently, his hands gripping the steering wheel with newfound determination. He had always known it would come to this. The reality of Elijah's past was not something he could avoid, and it wasn't something the boy could ever escape. The syndicate would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the pastor couldn't give up. Not now, not when the stakes were so high. He couldn't let the boy he loved fall into their hands. No matter what it took, he would protect Elijah, and he would fight for his future, even if it meant facing the full force of the syndicate head-on. Hours later, they arrived at the safe house. The cabin was small, nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. The air was cold and crisp, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the car. Pastor Thompson carried Elijah inside, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this would be their new life, at least for the time being. But as he looked around the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling of isolation that hung in the air. They weren't safe yet. Sarah had arranged for them to have everything they would need for the next few weeks: food, clothes, and most importantly, a way to stay off the grid. Pastor Thompson would have to do his best to keep Elijah occupied, to make sure the boy didn't ask questions about where they were going or why they couldn't go back to Fairfield. The boy was still young enough to be unaware of the dangers around him, but the pastor knew it wouldn't be long before Elijah would sense the change in the air. The days that followed were a blur of quiet routines. Pastor Thompson kept to a strict schedule, making sure they didn't draw attention to themselves. He and Sarah would go over the plans each night, adjusting their strategies and discussing their options. But even as they continued to prepare, the shadow of the syndicate loomed ever closer. Sarah had received multiple reports of unusual activity in the area, and Pastor Thompson could feel the pressure mounting. They couldn't afford to stay in the safe house for long. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when a knock on the door shattered the fragile peace they had worked so hard to create, that the pastor realized how close they were to losing everything. Pastor Thompson froze as the sound echoed through the stillness of the cabin. It was a sound he had feared, but had never expected to hear so soon. Sarah, who had been keeping watch, quickly grabbed the gun she had hidden beneath her jacket. She motioned for Pastor Thompson to stay low. The knock came again, louder this time. There was no mistaking it. The syndicate had found them. The pastor's heart raced as he pressed Elijah close to his chest. This was it, the moment he had feared. The moment everything he had worked for would either crumble or be forged into something stronger. "Get ready," Sarah whispered, her voice steely with resolve. "We won't let them take him." Pastor Thompson held Elijah tighter, his mind racing with options. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But he wasn't about to give up. Not when it came to Elijah's future. With one last look at the boy who had become a part of his soul, the pastor made a vow that, no matter the cost, he would protect Elijah, even if it meant taking on the full wrath of the syndicate.